Hi and welcome. I'm Midnight Truth, and it's so nice to have you here tonight, wherever you are right now. Whether you're in bed, lying on the couch, or just looking for a quiet moment, I want you to know this time is for you. Take a deep breath in, and as you breathe out, feel the weight of the day start to fade. Let your mind settle, let your body relax, and let yourself simply be. There's no rush, no pressure, just this calm, quiet moment. If you'd like, you can close your eyes and imagine yourself in a peaceful place. Maybe it's a cozy room with soft, warm lighting, or maybe it's under a starry sky, with a gentle breeze brushing against you. Wherever you feel safe and calm, let yourself drift there. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Tonight's story is gentle and soothing, perfect to carry you into a deep, restful sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. I never expected to start over in a place like this. The house was old, creaky, and smelled faintly of damp wood, and something else I couldn't quite place. But it was cheap. Too cheap for what it was. A two-story Victorian with a wraparound porch, tucked at the edge of town where the streetlights barely reached. I didn't ask questions. I just signed the lease. After the divorce, I needed a fresh start. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere far from the memories of my old life. This house, with its peeling wallpaper and slightly crooked doorways, felt like a blank slate. I spent the first day unpacking, shoving boxes into corners, and making mental notes of repairs I'd eventually have to make. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet, stretching like an old man waking up from a long nap. The kitchen faucet dripped at an uneven rhythm. The walls had a way of holding on to sound, like the house itself was listening. By the time night fell, exhaustion had settled deep in my bones. I set up my bed, just a mattress on the floor for now, in the master bedroom upstairs. The air was colder up there, but I chalked it up to the drafty windows. I slept hard that night, until something woke me. A sound, a slow, deliberate creak from the hallway outside my bedroom. I held my breath, listening. Silence. It was probably just the house settling. That's what people said about old places like this, right? I rolled over, pulling the blanket tighter around me. Still, it took me a long time to fall back asleep. The next morning, I met my neighbor, Mrs. Kearney. She was in her 70s, dressed in a faded floral dress, her white hair tied in a loose bun. She stood at the edge of my driveway, watching me struggle with a box of books. "That house," she said, shaking her head. "Strange place." I forced a smile. "Yeah, it's got character." She didn't smile back. "A man lived there before you. Didn't last long. Said he heard things at night. Ran out screaming one morning, babbling about curses." I laughed nervously. "Well, that's reassuring." Mrs. Kearney just shrugged. "You'll see for yourself soon enough." Then she turned and walked away. That night, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, slow and heavy, moving outside my bedroom door. And this time, I wasn't so sure it was just the house settling. Any adjustments, or if you'd like me to continue with Chapter 2. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding hard against my ribs. For a moment, I wasn't sure why. Then I remembered. The footsteps, the whisper. I sat up in bed, my body stiff from lying awake most of the night. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and checked the time. 6:12 a.m. Early, but I knew I wouldn't be getting any more sleep. I swung my legs over the side of the mattress and stood up, rubbing the back of my neck. My throat was dry, and I needed water. The house was quiet now, the eerie stillness making me feel like I was the only person in the world. As I walked toward the door, I hesitated. I wasn't sure why, but something about opening it made my stomach twist. It was stupid. It was just a door, just a hallway, just an old house that creaked at night. I turned the knob and pushed it open. The hallway stretched before me, dim and empty. The wooden floor looked the same as it had yesterday, except for one thing, a footprint. My breath caught in my throat. It was large, bare, the toes and heel clearly outlined in the thin layer of dust that had settled overnight. It wasn't mine. I had worn socks to bed. I swallowed hard, my eyes following the trail. There was only one print, but it was angled slightly, as if someone had been standing there, facing my door. A chill ran through me. The air suddenly felt colder, like an unseen draft was moving through the house. I stepped over the print, trying not to think too much about it. Maybe it was from before I moved in. Maybe the last tenant had walked barefoot one night, and I had just never noticed. But that didn't explain the whisper. I shook my head. I was letting my imagination get the best of me. It was early, I was exhausted, and I needed coffee. I made my way downstairs, my steps slow and deliberate. The house still felt unfamiliar, like it hadn't quite accepted me yet. In the kitchen, I started a pot of coffee and leaned against the counter, waiting. The morning light filtered through the small window above the sink, casting long shadows across the worn tile floor. I tried to focus on normal things, the to-do list in my head, the boxes I still had to unpack, the leaky faucet I needed to fix. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the night before. The creaking footsteps, the voice, the footprint. A sudden knock at the front door made me jump. I cursed under my breath and exhaled sharply, trying to steady my nerves. I wasn't used to visitors. When I opened the door, Mrs. Kearney stood on my porch, her wrinkled face set in a knowing expression. "Morning," she said. Morning," I replied, running a hand through my hair. She peered past me into the house, then back at me. "Did you sleep all right?" I hesitated. The question felt too pointed, too deliberate. "Yeah," I lied. She nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe me. "You know," she said, "I had a friend who lived in that house. Years ago." I shifted my weight. "Yeah." She nodded, her gaze steady. "Didn't last long, though. He said the nights were the worst." I forced a chuckle. "Let me guess. Strange noises." Her expression didn't change. "Something like that." A gust of wind rustled the trees lining the street, and for a brief second, I felt a strange sensation crawl up my spine, like I was being watched. Mrs. Kearney tightened her shawl around her shoulders. "You be careful in there," she said, then turned and walked away without another word. I stood in the doorway, watching her retreat down the sidewalk. The coffee pot beeped behind me, pulling me from my thoughts. I stepped back inside, closing the door behind me, and tried to shake off the conversation. She was just an old woman with stories. That's all. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, staring at the wood grain, my mind drifting. I thought about the footprint, about the basement. Something about that space unsettled me. I hadn't gone down there yet. Not really. Just enough to peek inside, to get a whiff of that strange metallic smell. A part of me didn't want to go down there, but another part, the part that needed answers, told me I had to. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and walked back into the kitchen. The basement door stood there, closed but looming, like it was waiting. I hesitated for a moment before gripping the handle. It felt colder than it should have. I turned it and pulled the door open. Darkness gaped at me. The air that wafted up was thick and stale, carrying the scent of damp stone and something else. Something I couldn't quite place. I took the first step down. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight. My flashlight beam cut through the blackness, illuminating the stone walls and low ceiling. The basement wasn't big, just a single open space with an old workbench against the far wall. Rusted tools hung from hooks, untouched for who knew how long. And then I saw them, the scratches, deep, uneven gouges carved into the stone itself. My stomach twisted. They were long, jagged, as if someone or something had clawed at the walls in desperation. I took a slow step closer. My breath felt too loud in the confined space. The marks ran across the entire wall, some deeper than others. And then I saw something else. A symbol, faint, nearly worn away, but there, etched into the stone like the scratches had tried to cover it up. I reached out, running my fingers over the rough edges. The shape was strange, unfamiliar, a circle with sharp angles cutting through it. A cold breeze swept through the basement, making the hair on my arms rise. I turned sharply, shining my flashlight around. The space was empty, but I had the overwhelming feeling that I was not alone. I backed away from the wall, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I needed to get out. As I turned toward the stairs, something shifted behind me. A whisper, low, breathy. I froze. The flashlight flickered. My entire body tensed, every muscle screaming at me to move. And then, right beside my ear, I heard it. You don't belong here. I bolted. I practically flew up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My chest heaved, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears. I pressed my back against the door, waiting, listening. Silence. The house felt wrong. The walls too tight. The air too still. I ran a hand over my face, trying to steady myself. I needed to leave, just for a little while, just to clear my head. I grabbed my keys and headed for the front door. As I stepped outside, the morning sun hit my face, but it didn't chase away the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I didn't know what was happening in that house, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in there, and whatever was with me, it didn't want me to stay. Let me know if you want any tweaks before I move on to Chapter 3. I didn't go back inside for hours. I drove aimlessly around town, stopping at a diner for a coffee I didn't even drink. I just sat in the booth, staring out the window, replaying what had happened in the basement. The scratches, the symbol, the whisper. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe the stress of the move, the loneliness, and the exhaustion were catching up with me. Or maybe something was really wrong with that house. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was starting to set. The house loomed in the fading light, its windows dark and empty. The thought of stepping back inside made my skin crawl, but I had no choice. It was my house. I lived there. Whatever was happening, I couldn't just run from it. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and stepped inside. The air was colder than it should have been. The smell of dust and old wood clung to the place. But beneath that was something else. Something faint but unmistakable. Rot. I hesitated in the doorway, my fingers tightening around my keys. The smell hadn't been there before. It was subtle, but now that I noticed it, it was impossible to ignore. I set my keys down on the entryway table, my ears straining for any sound. The house was quiet, too quiet. I made my way to the kitchen. The basement door stood closed, just as I had left it, and yet something about it felt different, like it was waiting. I swallowed hard and stepped closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the knob. It was ice cold. I pressed my ear against the door. Silence. I let out a breath and backed away. I wasn't ready to go back down there. Not yet. Instead, I turned on every light in the house. The living room, the hallway, the kitchen, every single lamp, every overhead bulb. The place was bathed in artificial light, but it didn't make me feel any safer. I moved to the couch and sat down, rubbing my temples. I needed sleep, real sleep. Maybe things would feel normal in the morning, but deep down I knew they wouldn't. I turned on the TV for background noise, but I wasn't really watching. My gaze kept drifting toward the kitchen, toward the basement door. Hours passed. The sky outside turned black. I told myself I wouldn't stay up all night again, but every time I closed my eyes, I thought about the whisper, about the cold air against my skin, about the footprint. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up with a start. A sound had pulled me from sleep. I sat up, heart pounding. The TV was still on, the soft hum of late-night infomercials filling the room. Then I heard it again, a creak, from the kitchen. I turned my head slowly. The basement door was open, wide open. I stared, my body frozen in place. I knew. I had locked it. Something moved in the darkness beyond the doorway. A slow, shuffling sound, like feet dragging against the floor. Every hair on my body stood on end. I should have run. I should have grabbed my keys and bolted out the front door. But I didn't. I stood, my legs shaky, and took a slow step toward the kitchen. The air grew colder with each step. My breath came in shallow gasps. I stopped just short of the doorway, staring into the black void beyond the basement steps. Silence. I reached out with a trembling hand and flipped the kitchen light switch. The bulb flickered. For a split second, in that brief flash of light, I saw something at the top of the basement stairs. A figure. Tall. Too tall. Its limbs were wrong, stretched, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, deep hollow pits, were locked onto mine. The light went out. The darkness swallowed everything. A sharp, icy breath hit the back of my neck. A voice, low and guttural, rasped against my ear. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come back. Asterisk, I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I sprinted to the living room, yanked open the front door, and stumbled outside. Cold night air hit my face, but I didn't stop. I ran to my car, fumbled with my keys, and threw myself inside. Locking the doors did nothing to make me feel safer. I gripped the steering wheel, my breath ragged, my hands shaking violently. The house stood in front of me, silent and still. The porch light flickered once, then went out, and then the basement door slammed shut. The echo of it rang in the quiet night. I sat there for what felt like forever, staring at the house, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen what I knew I had, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whisper, the thing on the stairs. But I couldn't, because in the silence of my car, with the engine off and the world still around me, I could hear it, a soft, slow creaking sound, footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, coming up from the basement and moving toward the front door. I turned the key in the ignition, my hands slick with sweat. The engine roared to life, and I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching against the pavement. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I spent the night in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. I barely slept, my mind racing, my skin still crawling with the memory of that breath on my neck. By morning, I had made my decision. I was going back, not to live there, not to stay, but to figure out what the hell was in that house. Because whatever it was, it didn't want me to leave. It wanted me to come back, and I needed to know why. I sat in my car outside the house, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The morning light did little to chase away the dread that had settled in my chest. The house stood there, silent and unmoving, as if nothing had happened the night before, as if I hadn't seen what I'd seen. But I had, and now I was back. I didn't know if that made me brave or just incredibly stupid. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The air was crisp, but the moment I crossed the threshold onto the porch, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather seeped into my skin. I reached for the doorknob. It was unlocked. I was certain I had locked it when I ran out. The thought made my stomach twist, but I pushed the door open anyway. The house greeted me with silence. The living room looked untouched. My keys were still on the entryway table. The TV remote sat exactly where I had left it, but the basement door was closed. I stood in the doorway for a long moment listening. Nothing. Still, I didn't trust it. I stepped inside, moving slowly, my ears straining for the slightest sound. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but that was all. No whispers, no footsteps. Maybe whatever had happened last night was over, or maybe it was waiting, I made my way to the kitchen, eyeing the basement door. My chest felt tight, but I forced myself to step closer. I reached out, pressing my palm flat against the wood. Ice cold. I yanked my hand back. I had to go down there. I didn't want to, but I needed answers. If I let fear control me, I'd never set foot in this house again. I grabbed a flashlight from the counter, took a deep breath, and pulled the basement door open. The smell hit me immediately, stronger than before. Rotting wood, damp stone, and something else. Something metallic. I swallowed the lump in my throat and clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the steps leading down into the abyss. I took the first step. The wood groaned beneath me. I hesitated, then forced myself to keep going. Step by step, I descended, my breathing shallow, my pulse hammering in my ears. The light flickered. I froze. No, not now. I smacked the flashlight against my palm, and the beam steadied. I let out a shaky breath and continued. At the bottom of the stairs, the air was even colder. The scratches on the walls seemed deeper in the dim light. The strange symbol, half hidden beneath the gouges, stood out more than before. I stepped closer, kneeling to get a better look. The edges were rough, like it had been carved with something blunt. My fingers traced the grooves. Something about it felt wrong. The light flickered again. Then I heard it, a breath, right behind me. Cold, damp air ghosted across my neck. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my grip. Nothing, just the empty basement. But the air felt different, thicker, like something unseen was pressing against me. I backed toward the stairs, every instinct screaming at me to get out. And then, a thud from above. Something had moved in the house. I turned off the flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. I don't know why I did it, some primal urge to hide, to not let whatever was up there know I was down here. I held my breath. Silence. Then, a slow, deliberate creak of a floorboard. Someone or something was walking above me. I clenched my jaw to keep from making a sound. My body screamed for me to run, to flee up the stairs and out the door. But I didn't move. I listened. The footsteps were heavy, slow, moving through the house with an eerie precision, like they were searching. And then they stopped, right at the top of the basement stairs. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. My pulse was so loud I swore it would give me away. A long, unbearable silence stretched on. Then a whisper, soft, barely audible. Asterisk, come back. Asterisk, my breath hitched. The basement door creaked. I turned the flashlight back on just as the door slammed shut. I scrambled to my feet, my chest heaving. I ran up the stairs two at a time, reaching the top and slamming into the door. I twisted the knob. Locked. No, no, no. I yanked at it, my breath coming in frantic gasps. The door wouldn't budge. A low creak came from the other side, the floor shifting beneath something heavy. It was standing right there. I pressed my ear against the wood. Silence. Then a single knock. Soft, deliberate. I stumbled back, my body trembling. I turned, scanning the basement, looking for anything I could use to get out. Then I saw it, a small wooden box sitting on the workbench. I hadn't noticed it before. It looked old, the edges worn with time. My hands shook as I reached for it. The wood was rough, splintering beneath my fingers. I lifted the lid. Inside was a stack of old, yellowed papers. A journal. I flipped to the first page, my breath catching in my throat as I read the name scrawled in faded ink. Edwin Hargrove. I knew that name. The original owner of the house. The man who had built it. The man who had vanished without a trace. My hands tightened around the fragile pages as I read the first entry. Asterisk, the ritual is nearly complete. The door is opening. God help me. Asterisk. A loud bang shook the basement. I jolted, dropping the book. The air grew frigid, the room pressing in around me. Then, the sound of something dragging across the floor above. Heavy, slow, moving toward the basement door. I grabbed the journal, my fingers curling around the aged paper. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew one thing. I had to get out of this house before it found me. Let me know if you want any tweaks before I move on to Chapter 5. I sat in my locked car, gripping Edwin Hargrove's journal so tightly the brittle pages crinkled under my fingers. My breath came in shallow gasps, my pulse hammering so loudly it drowned out the world around me. The house loomed in the rearview mirror, silent and still in the early morning light. But I knew better. It wasn't empty. Something was in there, and it wanted me to stay. I turned the journal over in my hands, swallowing against the dryness in my throat. My gut told me that whatever was happening, whatever had been happening for years, started with this. With Edwin Hargrove. I needed to know what he had done. I needed to understand what I was up against. I took a deep breath and flipped to the first entry. The ink was faded, the cursive writing uneven, as though written in a shaking hand. October 3rd, 1907. I have built this house with my own hands, brick by brick, wood by wood. It is my greatest achievement, my grandest creation, but it is not yet complete. There is work to be done. The door must be opened. I frowned, rereading the last line. What door? Flipping ahead, I scanned the next few entries. Most were mundane. Notes about construction supplies, even a mention of his wife, Margaret. But then, several pages in, the tone shifted. October 17th, 1907. The symbols are correct. The placement is precise. I followed the instructions exactly, yet I feel something watching me, something waiting. The air in the basement is thick with it. I must press on. A chill ran through me. The symbols. I thought about the carving I had found on the basement wall, half hidden beneath the scratches. Had Edwin put it there? And if he had, why? My fingers trembled as I turned the page. October 21st, 1907. The ritual is nearly complete. The door is opening. God help me. I exhaled shakily, my grip on the journal tightening. Door, ritual, opening. Edwin had done something, summoned something, and he had regretted it. But if he had unleashed something inside the house, what had happened to him? There were no more entries. The rest of the pages were blank. I closed the journal and leaned back in my seat, staring at the house through the windshield. I should have driven away. I should have gone straight to a motel, booked a moving company to collect my things, and never looked back. But I couldn't. I needed answers. I needed to know what Edwin had brought into this house, and I needed to know if I could stop it. The house felt different when I stepped back inside. Colder, heavier, like it was aware of me now. I moved cautiously through the living room, past the kitchen and straight to the basement door. It was still locked, but the key, my key, was sitting on the counter. I hadn't put it there. My hands were clammy as I picked it up. The metal was unnaturally cold against my skin. I hesitated. Then, before I could second-guess myself, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The basement was exactly as I had left it, except for one thing, the workbench. The journal had been on top of it when I fled last night. Now, in its place was something else. A single, long scrap of paper, torn, old. My heart pounded as I stepped closer. The paper was covered in the same looping handwriting as the journal. Edwin's handwriting. I lifted it carefully, my stomach twisting as I read the frantic scrawl. It knows. It sees. Do not let it in. Do not open the door. The paper slipped from my fingers. My breath caught in my throat as something creaked behind me. I turned slowly. The basement door was swinging shut. I lunged for it, but it slammed closed before I could reach it. The sound echoed in the dark, ringing in my ears. I grabbed the knob and twisted, locked. No, no, no. A soft whisper rasped through the room. Too late. The flashlight flickered, and then I saw it. In the farthest corner of the basement, just beyond the reach of the dim light, a shape. Tall. Gaunt. Its limbs too long. Its fingers like crooked branches. Its head tilted slowly, eyes hollow and sunken. And then it moved. Not with the sluggish, jerky motions I expected, but fast. Too fast. Straight for me. The light went out. I staggered backward, slamming into the workbench. My breath came in ragged gasps as I fumbled for anything, to defend myself. The journal, the paper, the flashlight. None of it would help me now. A whisper coiled around me in the dark. The door is open. The air rushed from my lungs as something cold wrapped around my wrist. A grip, solid, unrelenting. I thrashed, pulling away, my skin burning with icy pain. My foot caught on the edge of the workbench, and I fell, slamming hard against the concrete floor. The flashlight rolled, flickering once. For the briefest moment, the basement was illuminated again, and I saw it, not just the thing looming over me, but the door behind it, not the basement door, a different door, a door that hadn't been there before, a door carved into the wall, black, pulsing, open, a gaping void of writhing shadows, stretching into a place that did not belong in this world, and something worse was coming through. The flashlight died. The basement plunged into darkness again. A voice, Edwin's voice, whispered from nowhere and everywhere at once. Do not let it in. My pulse surged. I had to close it. I scrambled to my feet, my body screaming in protest. The darkness around me shifted, unnatural shapes riding at the edge of my vision. I grabbed the paper Edwin had left. Do not open the door. It was already open, but maybe I could seal it. I ran toward the black void, raising the journal, the page, anything I had left, and the thing in the dark, the thing that wasn't Edwin screamed. The sound was raw, violent, shaking the very foundation of the house. I pressed the paper to the door. The shadows convulsed, and then everything stopped. The air stilled. The cold vanished. The house settled into silence. I was standing alone in the basement, the journal clutched in my hands. The door was gone. The thing was gone. But something inside me knew. I hadn't destroyed it. I had only locked it away. For now. I left that night. I never went back. The house still stands, waiting for its next tenant. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear, I can still hear it. That whisper. The door is opening. Let me know if this works before I continue with Chapter 6. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even try. I drove for hours, passing motel after motel, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. The journal sat in the passenger seat like a weight, its presence a reminder of everything I had just been through. My mind kept replaying it all. The basement, the door, the thing that had grabbed me, the thing that wasn't gone. I knew it wasn't gone. At some point, exhaustion won. I found a rundown motel on the edge of town, handed over cash, and locked myself inside the room. The bed was stiff, the air stale, but I didn't care. I just needed to rest. But as I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I felt it. That same heaviness, that same presence. I wasn't alone. I sat up too fast, my breath coming in short gasps. My skin was clammy with sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for the journal, flipping through its pages as if I would find some reassurance inside. Instead, I found something else, a new entry. I stared at it, my fingers numb. It hadn't been there before. The ink was fresh, The words scrawled in frantic, uneven strokes. You shouldn't have left. I slammed the journal shut and shoved it across the bed. No, 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 no. This wasn't happening. It was over. I had locked it away. Hadn't I? I sat still for what felt like hours, staring at the closed journal, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion won again. I curled up on the bed, forcing my eyes shut. I drifted into sleep, and then I heard it, scratching, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves against a window. Then louder, closer. I sat up in the darkness, heart pounding, ears straining. It was coming from the door, slow, deliberate, clawing sounds. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just listened. A pause. Then 3 sharp, deliberate scratches. Like something was marking the door. Like something was letting me know it was still here. I reached for my phone with shaking hands, turning on the flashlight. The room flooded with cold white light. The scratching stopped. Silence. I waited, ears straining, but there was nothing. Slowly, I slipped out of bed and crept toward the door. My pulse thumped in my throat. I didn't want to see. I didn't want to know, but I had to. I lifted the phone, aiming the light at the wood. My stomach turned. 3 deep scratches. Fresh. Right below the handle. I stumbled back, slapping the light switch. The motel room flickered into full brightness, chasing away the shadows. I stood frozen, staring at the marks, my breath ragged and uneven. Then, as if on instinct, I turned toward the mirror. I don't know why. Maybe I already knew what I would see. At first, there was nothing, just my own pale, wide-eyed reflection. But then, behind me, something moved, a shape, not in the room, in the mirror, watching, waiting. I spun around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. I was alone, but when I turned back to the mirror, the shape was still there, standing just behind me, closer now, so close I could feel it, breath on my neck, a whisper, too soft to understand. My body locked up, every muscle screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, my reflection smiled. Not me. Its mouth stretched too wide, its teeth too sharp. I stumbled back, knocking over the nightstand. My phone clattered to the floor. The mirror shook. The whole room shook. And then, the lights went out. A rush of cold air. A voice, low and broken, whispering in my ear. You never left. Darkness swallowed me whole. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. I don't remember leaving the motel. I don't remember getting into my car. But somehow, I was back behind the wheel, speeding down the empty highway, the journal open beside me. And the words had changed. That single line, you shouldn't have left. It was gone, scratched out, and in its place, something new. It's still open. I gripped the wheel, knuckles white. I didn't need to ask what it meant. I already knew. The door, the thing I thought I had sealed away, it wasn't locked. Not completely. And now, it was coming for me. I slammed my foot on the gas, watching the road disappear beneath me. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. Let me know if this works before I continue with Chapter 7. I didn't want to go back. I swore to myself that I wouldn't. But I had no choice. The road stretched endlessly in front of me, dark and empty, the glow of my headlights barely piercing the thick night. I hadn't seen another car in miles, just the endless asphalt, the towering trees, and the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. I gripped the wheel, my pulse pounding. The journal sat open on the passenger seat. The word's still there. It's still open. No matter how many times I blinked, no matter how much I wished it away, the ink never faded. I'd left the house, but it hadn't left me. The scratches on the motel door, The thing in the mirror. The voice whispering in the dark. It wasn't bound to the house. It had followed me. Or worse, maybe it had always been with me. I pressed harder on the gas, the needle creeping past 70. My hands ached from how tightly I gripped the wheel. I needed to do something. I needed to end this. But how? My mind raced, piecing together the fragments of what I knew. Edwin Hargrove had built that house himself. He had followed instructions. He had done a ritual, opened a door I had only temporarily shut. I glanced at the journal, flipping back through the pages. There had to be something I missed, some clue. The pages rustled, the old paper fragile beneath my fingers. And then I found it, a passage I hadn't noticed before, tucked between two unevenly cut pages. November 2nd, 1907. It is wrong. It is all wrong. The thing in the dark, it watches, it listens, it moves through the walls, through the very bones of this house. I hear it whispering to me in my sleep. It knows my name, asterisk, asterisk. I try to shut the door, tried to erase what I had done, but it will not be erased. It cannot be undone, asterisk, asterisk. I cannot leave. It will not let me, asterisk, asterisk. If I leave, it will follow. It will be free, asterisk, asterisk. My breath hitched. Edwin had known. He had understood what he had done too late. And he had stayed, not because he wanted to, but because if he left, whatever he had unleashed would be unchained from the house. Just like it was now. A chill crept over my skin. I wasn't supposed to leave. I had set it loose. The car felt smaller suddenly, the air tighter, the darkness outside pressing in. Then, a shape, in the road, tall, thin, motionless. I slammed the brakes. The tires screeched against the pavement. My heart leapt into my throat as the car skidded sideways, headlights swinging wildly. For a split second, the figure was illuminated in the beam. My stomach dropped. It was me, not just someone who looked like me. Me, standing in the middle of the road, still, expressionless, watching. The car spun. The back end slammed into a tree. The impact jolted through my bones, the airbag exploding in my face. For a moment, everything was muffled, distant, then silence. I groaned, pain shooting through my ribs as I pushed myself upright. The car was totaled, smoke curling from the hood. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned, looking back at the road. The figure was gone, but I could still feel it. Watching, waiting. I grabbed the journal with shaking hands and pushed open the door. My legs were weak, unsteady beneath me, but I forced myself forward. I knew what I had to do. I had to go back, to the house, to the basement, to the door, and this time, I had to shut it for good. I staggered back to the highway, my head pounding. The nearest gas station was miles away. My phone had no signal. I was alone, but not really. A whisper drifted through the trees, soft as the wind. You never left. I didn't look back. I just started walking, and the road stretched on, long and empty, as the thing in the dark followed. Let me know if this works before I continue with Chapter 8. The walk back to the house felt longer than it should have. The night stretched endlessly around me, thick and suffocating. The air was too still, the trees lining the highway too silent. No distant hum of cars, no rustling of leaves. Just me and the sound of my own footsteps. And something else. A second pair of footsteps, not in sync with mine. A fraction too slow. A fraction too close. I didn't turn around. I knew better than that. I kept my head down, my grip on the journal so tight my knuckles ached. My ribs throbbed from the crash. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to move faster. The house was waiting. The thing inside it was waiting, too. I don't know how long I walked, only that the dark road eventually gave way to familiar ground. The long driveway, the looming silhouette of the house, standing just as I had left it. Something about it looked different now. Darker, hollow, like it had been emptied out, like something had crawled free. I hesitated at the front steps, my fingers hovering over the doorknob. The brass felt ice cold beneath my touch. A breath of wind curled around me. A whisper, low and broken. "Come home." I swallowed hard and pushed the door open. The air inside was stale. The house was silent. No hum of the refrigerator. No creak of settling wood. Just empty, suffocating stillness. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. My own breath sounded too loud in the quiet. I had to go to the basement, had to finish this. But as I moved forward, something shifted in the corner of my vision. A shadow, not mine. I turned my head slowly. The hallway mirror. My reflection stood there, too still, too stiff, a second behind my movements. I took a step forward. The reflection did not. I stopped breathing. The mirror was wrong. Something else was in it. The reflection's lips began to curl. Not a normal smile. Something wide, stretched, splitting the skin at the edges. My stomach twisted. Then the smile spoke. "You never left." I stumbled back. The mirror shuddered violently, cracks splintering across the glass. My reflection distorted, warping, stretching. A hand burst through the glass. Not mine. Something long, thin, wrong. Fingers clawing for me. I turned and ran. The house shook. A deep, shuddering groan, like the wood itself was breathing. The lights flickered wildly. Shadows swirled at the edges of my vision, moving like liquid, pooling into the corners. The basement door stood open, waiting. I forced myself to move forward, legs heavy, lungs burning. I stumbled down the stairs, gripping the railing for support. The air grew colder, thicker. The smell of damp earth and something older, something rotten, filled my lungs. The door was still there, the heavy wooden slab, carved with strange symbols. But something was wrong. The markings had changed. No longer the crude carvings of a desperate man trying to contain something. Now, they were clean, precise, like something had rewritten them. My breath hitched. Then, the door creaked open. Not much, just enough. Darkness pooled through the crack like ink, spilling into the room. A whisper curled from within. Not a voice, not a word, just sound. Wrong, shifting, slithering sound. A shadow moved behind the door. Something shifting, something waiting. The journal trembled in my grip. The final entry burned in my mind. It is still open. I had to close it. For good. I stepped forward, raising the journal, heart hammering. The air thickened, pressing down on me. The symbols on the door shifted, the carvings writhing like something alive. And then a hand shot through the gap, pale, too long, fingers like bone, tipped with jagged, black nails. Gripping my wrist, I screamed, my body locking up. Cold, too cold, like sinking into deep, frozen water. The grip tightened. I was being pulled into the dark, into the hollow. I fought back, my muscles screaming, my vision blurred, my body growing numb. And then I saw it, the figure, standing behind the door, watching. It had no face, just a stretched black mouth, grinning, waiting. The world around me flickered, like a dying film reel. The house, the walls, the floor, it all shuddered. I forced my hand free, raised the journal, and slammed it against the door. A scream tore through the basement. Not human, not anything that should exist in this world. The darkness rushed back, sucked into the crack like a closing wound. The door slammed shut. The house shook. The walls cracked. The air split apart. Then, silence. The cold was gone. The whispering stopped. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath. My skin burned where the thing had touched me. an aching, frozen mark seared into my flesh. The door remained shut. No movement, no sound. I didn't know if it was over, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stay. I stumbled to my feet, forcing myself up the stairs. My vision blurred, my legs weak, but I kept going. Through the hall, through the front door, out into the night. I didn't stop, didn't look back. The house loomed behind me, watching, waiting. The whisper curled in the wind, soft, faint, but still there. You never left. I ran, and the house stood, dark and waiting, for the next one to enter. Let me know if this works before I continue with Chapter 9. I kept running. My body screamed at me to stop, but I didn't listen. I didn't dare. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, swallowed by the thick darkness of the night. My breath came in ragged gasps, my lungs burning. My feet ached. My legs threatened to give out, but I couldn't stop. Not until I was far away. Not until I knew I was safe. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I would never be safe again. The cold feeling still clung to my wrist, where the thing had grabbed me. No amount of rubbing, no amount of heat could chase it away. It wasn't just a sensation. It was a stain, something left behind. I didn't know how long I ran before I saw headlights in the distance. A car. For the first time that night, hope flickered in my chest. I stumbled into the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically. The car slowed, tires crunching against the pavement as it came to a stop. The driver was an older man, weathered face full of concern as he rolled down the window. "Jesus, kid, you all right?" I couldn't even form words. I just nodded, breathless, shivering. "Where the hell did you come from? You need a ride." I hesitated for only a second before nodding again. I needed to get as far away from that house as possible. The man unlocked the door and I climbed in. The warmth of the car's interior wrapped around me, but the chill in my bones didn't fade. As we pulled away, I forced myself to glance in the side mirror. The house was still there, distant, silent, but something moved in one of the upstairs windows. A shape, watching. I tore my eyes away, my fingers tightening into fists. The driver cleared his throat, glancing at me. "You sure you're okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I swallowed hard. Something worse, I wanted to say, but instead I just nodded. "Where you headed?" he asked. I didn't know. I had no home, no destination, just a desperate need to get away. "Anywhere but here," I murmured. The driver didn't push. He just nodded, turning his eyes back to the road. We drove in silence. The night stretched on, the road rolling beneath us. But no matter how far we went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, still being followed, that I had never really left at all. I clenched my wrists, feeling the cold seared into my skin. Something had marked me, and I knew, no matter how far I ran, it would find me again. The darkness was alive. It wasn't just an absence of light. It had weight presence. It pressed against my skin, crawled into my lungs, wrapped around me like fingers dragging me under. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, could barely breathe. The whispering was all around me now, filling the room, filling my head. It slithered through my ears, deeper, deeper, until it was inside me. You never left. Something touched my shoulder. Cold, wrong, not fingers, not anything human. My body locked up. My chest felt tight, like invisible hands were pressing down, squeezing the air from my lungs. I tried to move, to run, but the darkness was thick, pulling me down like quicksand. Then I saw them, eyes, not glowing, not reflecting light, just empty, black holes, sunken deep into the shadows, watching me, waiting. The whispering changed, not just sound anymore. Now, it had words, low, Broken. Come back. I forced my legs to move, stumbling backward. My foot caught on something, I didn't know what, and I crashed to the floor. Pain shot up my spine, but I barely felt it over the ice spreading through my veins. The thing in the dark moved, not walking, not gliding, just shifting, like it wasn't bound by the same rules as everything else. A long, stretched grin carved across its face. It was closer now, too close. I scrambled backward, my palms scraping against the rough motel carpet. The air was thick, suffocating. The walls felt like they were closing in. Then, the whispering stopped. Silence, heavy, expectant, and then a voice. Not the whispering anymore. A voice I recognized. Mine, from the mirror. You never left. I snapped my head toward the mirror, my breath locking in my throat. The reflection wasn't mine. It looked like me, but it wasn't. The eyes were too dark, too hollow. The mouth stretched too wide in that awful, impossible grin. It lifted a hand, slow, deliberate, and waved. Something behind me moved. Too late. The air snapped cold and violent, and I was pulled under. Not physically, not in a way I could explain. 1 second, I was in the motel room. The next, I wasn't. I was somewhere else. The air was heavy with damp, rotting earth. The walls, if they were walls, shifted, pulsing like they were breathing. And the whispers were everywhere, louder, clearer, no escape. A figure stood in front of me, the same hollow shape, the same stretched grin. It reached out, long fingers curling toward me, and I realized it wasn't taking me somewhere. It was taking me back to the house, back to the basement, back to the door that should have never been opened. I tried to resist, but I had no body, no form, just my mind, my fear, trapped in this endless, shifting void. The figure moved closer. The grin stretched wider. I screamed, and the world shattered. Light, noise. I was back in the motel, on the floor, gasping for air. The room was silent. The mirror was intact. The door was still closed. The chair still wedged beneath the handle. Like nothing had happened. Like it had all been a dream. But it wasn't. I could still feel the cold in my wrist. Still hear the whispering in the back of my mind. Still feel the thing that had grabbed me, pulled me, tried to take me back. I wasn't free. I would never be free. Because now I understood the house wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just cursed. It was alive. And it never let go. I left the motel before the sun came up. I didn't pack my things. Didn't look back. I just walked out into the cold morning air and kept moving. The town was empty at this hour. The streets stretched ahead of me, quiet and endless. But I knew I couldn't stay here. I needed to go further. Somewhere new. Somewhere far. Somewhere it wouldn't find me. But no matter how far I ran, I knew the truth. It already had me. The cold in my wrist hadn't faded. If anything, it had spread. My fingers were numb, my arms stiff, like something was working its way into my bones. I could still hear the whispering, soft, distant, waiting. I needed answers, not about the house. I knew enough about that now, but about me, about what it had done to me. There was only one person who might know. Mrs. Holloway, the old woman from the bookstore. She had known something about the house, more than she had let on. She had warned me, and I hadn't listened. I found the town's library after a few hours of walking. It was an old brick building, smaller than I expected, tucked between two empty storefronts. I pushed through the doors, my heart pounding. A woman sat at the front desk, thin framed glasses perched on her nose, flipping through a stack of books. She barely looked up. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for someone," I said, my voice hoarse. An older woman, Mrs. Holloway. She used to run the bookstore in Grimwood. The librarian frowned. Grimwood, she repeated. Yes, I said, leaning forward. She knew about the house. I need to talk to her. The librarian stared at me for a long moment, then sighed. Sweetheart, Mrs. Holloway has been dead for 10 years. My stomach dropped. No, I said quickly. That's not possible. I just saw her. She talked to me, warned me about the house. The librarian shook her head. I don't know who you met, she said gently, but it wasn't Mrs. Holloway. I stepped back, my chest tightening. Dead. For 10 years. Had I really spoken to her? Had she really been there? Or had it been something else? I turned, walking out of the library in a daze. The air outside was sharp, biting, but I barely felt it. None of this was real. Or maybe it was all too real. I didn't stop moving. I couldn't. I needed to keep going. But as I walked down the empty street, something stopped me in my tracks. A reflection in a store window. My own. Or at least, it should have been. But the figure staring back at me wasn't quite right. The eyes were too dark. The grin was too wide. And as I stood there, frozen, it lifted its hand and waved. The whispering started again. Not outside. Not around me. Inside. Deep in my bones. Because I had never really left. And I never would. The hollow had me now. And it never lets go. The end. Story 2. I should have known better the moment I saw the house. The listing made it sound charming. A historic home with character, perfect for a fresh start. It was cheap, too, almost suspiciously so. But after the divorce, I wasn't in a position to be picky. I needed somewhere quiet. Somewhere far from the memories that clung to my old apartment like stale air. The drive to Blackwood Lane took me through winding roads flanked by dense trees, their gnarled branches twisting into an almost solid canopy. It was a kind of place where time seemed to slow, where the world felt just a little too quiet. The house itself sat at the very end of the street, nestled between two overgrown lots. It was taller than the surrounding homes, its faded blue paint peeling in long strips, revealing gray wood underneath. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, the railing warped from years of neglect. A few of the shutters hung crooked, one barely clinging to its hinges. I told myself it had character. When I stepped onto the porch, the wood groaned under my weight. I hesitated for just a second before slipping the key into the lock. The door was heavy, solid oak, and took more effort to push open than I expected. The inside was just as the listing described, spacious, filled with vintage charm, and in need of a little love. The walls were lined with old, floral wallpaper that had begun to peel in the corners. The ceiling was high, the crown molding intricate but cracked in places. A massive wooden staircase stood in the center of the foyer, leading up to the second floor. Dust motes floated lazily in the sunlight, filtering through the stained glass window above the door. I let out a breath. It was fine. I could make this place home. The moving company had dropped off my things earlier that morning, leaving boxes stacked in the living room. I spent most of the afternoon unpacking, placing books on the shelves, setting up the kitchen, trying to make the place feel less empty. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional pop of old wood settling. By early evening, exhaustion settled into my bones. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step creaking beneath me. My bedroom was at the end of the hall, the largest of the three. The previous owner had left behind a massive wooden armoire, too heavy to move, so I decided to keep it. As I lay in bed that night, the silence pressed against my ears. The house had a certain weight to it, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural, like it was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a noise, a slow, deliberate creak, like footsteps moving across the floor downstairs. I held my breath, my heart pounding. Another creak, then another. I sat up, straining to listen. The house was old. Of course, it made sounds. What expanded and shifted. Wind blew through unseen cracks. It was nothing. At least, that's what I told myself. The next morning, I made coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp, the morning fog still lingering low over the street. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed an elderly woman standing on the sidewalk, staring at the house. Her eyes were sharp, her mouth a thin, tight line. She clutched a knitted shawl around her thin shoulders, her knuckles white. "You just movin'?" she asked, her voice raspy. I nodded. "Yeah, yesterday." She didn't return my smile. Her gaze flicked up to the second-floor window, where my bedroom was. "No one stays in that house long," she said. I forced a chuckle. "Yeah, well, the price was right." She didn't laugh. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "You'll see," she murmured. Then she turned and shuffled away without another word. I stood there for a moment, an uneasy feeling creeping into my chest. I shook it off. Old houses had histories. Superstitious neighbors liked to gossip. It was nothing. That night, the noise came again. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when the first creak sounded from downstairs. Then another. Footsteps. Slow, measured, moving across the living room. I turned onto my side, gripping the blanket. The logical part of my brain told me it was just the house settling. Houses made noises, especially old ones like this. But deep down, something felt off. The footsteps stopped directly beneath my bedroom. Silence stretched out. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing. I let out a slow exhale, telling myself I was being paranoid. Eventually, sleep took me. The next few days passed in a blur of unpacking and settling in. I started to adjust to the quirks of the house. The way the kitchen faucet dripped no matter how tightly I turned the handle. The way the upstairs floorboards creaked when the wind blew just right. But at night, the footsteps returned, always slow, always deliberate, and always stopping just beneath my bedroom. I tried to ignore them, but as the days passed, an unshakable feeling of unease settled over me. It wasn't just the sounds. The air in the house felt different, heavier. Sometimes, I'd catch a whiff of something strange, something metallic and sharp, like rusting iron. On the fourth night, I woke suddenly, my throat dry. The room was cold, far colder than it should have been. I reached for the blanket, but a strange sensation made me freeze. The feeling of weight, like something was sitting at the edge of the bed. I held perfectly still, my breath caught in my chest. The air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't name. My skin prickled, my body screaming at me to move, to run. Then, as suddenly as it came, the weight lifted. The room felt normal again, the air warming. I sat up slowly, my hands shaking. I flicked on the bedside lamp, my heart pounding against my ribs. The room was empty, but when I looked down at the end of the bed, the blanket was pressed down, as if someone had been sitting there. A chill crawled up my spine. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I made a decision. I needed to find out what was wrong with this house. I started with the town records, and that's when I found the first mention of the original owner, Elias Blackwood, a man obsessed with the occult, a man who had lived and died inside this house. I stared at the records, my pulse quickening. The further I read, the worse it got. Stories of strange occurrences, people running from the house in fear, murmurs of rituals, of something lurking beneath the foundation, something that never left. I closed the book, my hands clammy. The footsteps, the cold spots, the weight on my bed. I wasn't imagining it. Something was in this house with me, and it was waiting for me to notice. I didn't sleep that night, even after the weight lifted from my bed. Even after the air returned to normal, I couldn't close my eyes. My body was still frozen in that moment, still caught in the suffocating silence of the house. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing. The room was washed in pale morning light, but I felt no relief. The blankets were tangled around my legs, my shirt damp with sweat. I forced myself to get up, ignoring the tightness in my chest. It was just a dream, a trick of the mind. The house was old, and I was probably psyching myself out. But deep down, I knew better. I spent the morning on my laptop, searching for any information I could find on Elias Blackwood. The name felt heavy, as if simply knowing it was an invitation to something I didn't understand. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Elias Blackwood had lived in the house over a century ago. He was a known recluse, rarely seen outside except on moonless nights, when neighbors reported seeing him standing in the yard, staring up at the sky. Some claimed he spoke to things that weren't there. Others swore they heard chanting from inside his house. Then one night, he vanished. No body was ever found, but the rumor spread like wildfire. Some said he'd opened a door to something beyond human understanding. Others whispered that he'd never left at all, that he simply slipped into the walls, into the very bones of the house. I shut the laptop, my stomach twisting. I needed to get out of the house. The air felt too thick, the walls too close. I grabbed my keys and stepped outside. The sun was high now, burning away the morning fog, but the house still cast an unnaturally long shadow over the porch. I shivered despite the warmth. As I locked the door, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. The old woman was back. She stood across the street, watching me. For a second, I considered ignoring her, but something inside me, curiosity, desperation, made me walk toward her. "You said no one stays in that house long," I said. "Why?" Her gaze flicked up to the second-floor window. "They hear things," she said simply. I swallowed. "Like what?" She shifted, pulling her shawl tighter around her bony frame. Footsteps, voices, whispers in the dark. A chill crawled up my spine. "Have you been inside?" She shook her head. No one would send steps inside that house. I hesitated. "Do you know who Elias Blackwood was?" Her eyes darkened. He was a man who wanted too much. I waited for her to continue, but she just turned and started walking away. I watched her go, unease coiling in my stomach. That night, the house felt different. Not just old, not just unsettling. It felt alive. The air crackled with something unseen, like static before a storm. Shadows stretched farther than they should have. The walls seemed to breathe. I told myself it was my imagination, but then the whispers started. At first, they were faint, a sound just on the edge of hearing, like the rustling of leaves or the soft hum of a distant conversation. Then they grew louder. Not words, not exactly, just a series of low, rasping sounds, weaving in and out of the darkness. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The whispers came from the hallway. I forced myself to move, slipping out of bed and creeping toward the door. My fingers hovered over the doorknob, hesitating. Then, just as suddenly as they started, the whispers stopped. Silence pressed in around me. I exhaled shakily and turned back toward my bed. But then, a creak, a single, deliberate step, right outside my door. I spun, my breath caught in my throat. For a long moment, I just stood there, heart hammering, waiting for another sound. Nothing. I reached for the doorknob. Slowly, I turned it and pulled the door open just a crack. The hallway was empty, but the air was freezing, thick with the scent of something rotting. My stomach churned. I slammed the door shut and locked it. Then, just as I stepped back, I heard it, a whisper right against the wood. "Let me in." I stumbled back, my body breaking out in cold sweat. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I had made a decision. I needed to know what was buried in the walls of this house, and I was going to find it. The next morning, I woke with the taste of metal in my mouth. My head ached. My body sore as if I had spent the night running instead of lying frozen in fear. The whisper against my door still echoed in my mind. Let me in. I moved through the house like a ghost, too drained to process what had happened. The whispers, the footsteps. None of it could be explained by old pipes or shifting wood. Something was inside this house with me, and it wanted me to know it. I spent the day researching, digging through old newspaper archives online, trying to piece together the history of the house. There was surprisingly little information. A few mentions of Elias Blackwood, whispers of his obsession with the occult, but nothing concrete. It was like most of the house's past had been scrubbed away. I needed more. I decided to check the basement. The door was in the kitchen, an old wooden thing with iron hinges that had rusted over time. It took some effort to yank it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. A damp, stale smell rose up to meet me. I hesitated. Every instinct in my body told me not to go down there, that whatever was waiting in the dark wasn't meant to be found. But I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. The house wasn't just haunted, it was hiding something. I took a deep breath and stepped down. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with dust. My flashlight flickered against the stone walls, revealing a mess of old furniture, rotting boxes, and rusted tools. And then, at the very back, half hidden behind an old dresser, a door. It was small, no taller than my chest, made of dark wood. Unlike the rest of the basement, it wasn't covered in dust. Someone had used it recently. A spike of fear drove into my stomach. I reached out, hesitating only for a moment before gripping the iron handle. It was ice cold beneath my fingers. I pulled. The door didn't budge. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Silence. Then, a faint shuffling sound. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. Something was inside, and it was moving. I scrambled up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. My hand shook as I locked it, my breath coming in short gasps. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this house. But something told me that no matter how far I ran, it wouldn't be enough. Because whatever was in that basement, it already knew me, and it wasn't going to let me go. I stood frozen, my fingertips still pressed against the warped wooden panel. A thin crack had opened along the edges, revealing only darkness beyond. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. The house had been hiding this, and something inside had been trying to get out. A part of me, every rational, self-preserving part, screamed to step away, to shut the panel, to pretend I had never heard the knock. But another part, something deep in my gut, knew that ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. I swallowed, steeling myself, and pushed the panel further. The wood groaned as it slid back, revealing a narrow, pitch-black gap barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. A cold draft seeped out from the darkness, carrying a damp, earthy smell, like old wood dust and something faintly metallic. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and shined it inside. At first, all I saw was dust swirling in the beam of light. Then, slowly, the space beyond took shape. It wasn't a full room, more like a cramped, hidden crawl space between the walls. The floor was made of rough, unfinished wood, and the ceiling slanted so low that I'd have to crouch to move inside. And then I saw it, a chair. It sat in the center of the narrow space, facing the panel as if someone had been sitting there waiting. The wood was cracked, the legs uneven. Ropes dangled from the armrests, frayed at the ends. The dust around it had been disturbed, like something had been moving, like something had been sitting there recently. I stepped back, my breath shallow. My phone's flashlight flickered. Then, a sound, soft, almost imperceptible. A whisper, not words, not yet, just the faintest exhale, brushing against the back of my neck. I spun, my pulse slamming into my ribs. The living room was empty. The house was silent. but the feeling of being watched had never been stronger. I backed away from the hidden space, gripping my phone so hard my fingers ached. Slowly, carefully, I slid the panel shut. The wood scraped against the floor, groaning as if protesting. And then, as soon as it was sealed, a single knock. From the other side, I nearly tripped over the couch, scrambling backward, my chest heaving. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that hidden room, it knew I had found it. I didn't sleep that night. The air in the house felt different, charged with something unseen. Every sound made my muscles tense. The ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall, the occasional groan of the pipes, the whisper of wind against the windows. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the feeling of cold air brushing against my face. The blankets had been pulled down to my waist. My bedroom door was open. I never left it open. I sat up slowly, the darkness pressing in around me. My phone was on the nightstand, the screen dimly glowing with the time. 3:12 a.m. Then the floor creaked, not from inside my room, from the hallway. My breath hitched. I strained to listen. Another creak, slow, deliberate, coming closer. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight and shining it toward the doorway. The hallway was empty, but the air had changed. It was thick, heavy, like something unseen was pressing against my skin. And then I heard it, a whisper, soft, right against my ear. You shouldn't have looked. I jumped out of bed, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. My skin crawled, my entire body screaming at me to get out. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and bolted. The moment I stepped onto the porch, the air lifted. The weight, the pressure, it was gone. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. My hands were ice cold. My pulse wouldn't slow. I couldn't stay in that house, but something told me that leaving wouldn't be enough, because whatever was inside that hidden space, it wasn't trapped anymore, and it wasn't finished with me. By morning, exhaustion had settled into my bones, but I couldn't afford to rest. I needed answers. The library in town had an archive of old property records, and I was determined to find out what the hell was happening in that house. I spent hours digging through old documents, scanning yellowed pages for any mention of hidden rooms, of disappearances, of Elias Blackwood. Then, finally, I found something. An article dated October 1893. Local man vanishes after unholy experiments. My breath caught in my throat as I read. The article described how Elias Blackwood had become increasingly obsessed with the idea of crossing the veil between the living and the dead. He believed the house was built on a thin place, a spot where the barrier between worlds was weaker. He conducted rituals, spoke to things that answered back. Neighbors reported seeing strange symbols carved into the trees surrounding the house, hearing voices coming from inside when no one was there. And then, one night, he was gone. No body, no sign of struggle, just an empty chair in a hidden room behind the walls, with ropes still tied to the armrests. My stomach twisted. The chair, the hidden room, it had been there all this time. I flipped the page, my eyes scanning the rest of the article. One final quote stood out, sending a chill down my spine. A house remembers its rituals, and sometimes it waits for someone new to finish what was started. I shut the book, my pulse hammering. The whispers, the footsteps, the knocking from inside the walls. It wasn't just a haunting. It was something else, something unfinished, something waiting. And I had been the one to open the door. I needed to go back. I needed to seal whatever had been let out before it was too late. I didn't drive straight home. I couldn't. The thought of stepping back into that house, of feeling the weight of something unseen pressing against my skin again, made my stomach twist. But I also knew I had no choice. If I left it alone, it wouldn't stop. It would follow me. I parked down the street and just sat there, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and empty. It looked the same as it always had, old, quiet, forgotten. But I knew better now. Something inside was waiting for me. I finally forced myself out of the car. The late afternoon air was cold, the sun already dipping behind the trees. Shadows stretched across the yard as I made my way to the front door, every step heavier than the last. The moment I stepped inside, the air shifted. It was subtle, but I felt it. The pressure, the stillness, like the house had been holding its breath, waiting for my return. I locked the door behind me and stood in the silence, listening. Nothing, but I wasn't fooled. I moved carefully through the house, checking each room, every corner. Everything was exactly as I had left it. No open doors, no misplaced objects, no sign that anything unnatural had happened here at all. But then I reached the living room, and I saw it, the panel in the wall. It was open, not all the way, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond. My pulse slammed against my ribs. I had closed it. I knew I had. I stepped closer, my throat dry, my fingers clenching into fists. The air was colder here, a sharp contrast to the rest of the house. I could see my breath curling in front of me. The smell was stronger now. Damp wood, dust, and something metallic. Blood. I swallowed hard and reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow space inside. The chair was still there, but now, something else was too. The floor. It had been covered in dust before, untouched for decades. But now, in the center of the space, the dust had been swept away, revealing something carved into the wood beneath. A symbol, a twisted, looping design etched deep into the floor. The edges were uneven, jagged, as if carved in a hurry or in desperation. It pulsed under the light like it was breathing. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I didn't want to step inside, but I had to. Carefully, I crouched down and ran my fingers along the carvings. The grooves were deep, rough, filled with years of dirt and grime. But the center was fresh. The wood there was splintered, as if someone or something had been scratching at it, trying to dig through. A cold sweat broke out along my spine. I pulled my hand back and stood quickly, my legs unsteady. My mind was racing. What was buried beneath this floor? A noise cut through the silence. A slow, deliberate creak. I turned sharply, heart pounding. The sound had come from upstairs. I grabbed the nearest object I could find, an old fireplace poker from the mantel, and gripped it tight. The metal was cold in my hands, grounding me. I moved toward the stairs, each step slow, cautious. The house felt different now, like it was watching. Another creak. At the end of the hall, I reached the top of the stairs, my breath shallow. My bedroom door was open. I hadn't left it open. I tightened my grip on the poker and stepped inside. The room looked untouched. The bed was still unmade from the night before. My phone charger coiled neatly on the nightstand. But then I saw the closet. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness peeking through. I stared at it, my pulse thudding in my ears. I knew deep down that I hadn't left it open. I took a slow, shaky step forward, then another. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the edge of the door. A whisper, soft, right behind me. No words, just breath. I spun around, swinging the fireplace poker wildly. Nothing. The room was empty. But the air was different now. It felt closer. I turned back to the closet. The door was wider now, as if something had moved it while my back was turned. I swallowed hard. I couldn't just leave it. I needed to see. I gritted my teeth and yanked the door open. The closet was empty. No clothes, no boxes, just bare walls and floor. But the back wall, it was wrong. It didn't match the rest of the house. The wood was a slightly different shade, newer, like it had been replaced or sealed. My stomach twisted. The hidden panel downstairs, the carved symbol, the scratching at the floor. It wasn't just a basement. There was something sealed inside this house, something trying to get out. I stepped closer, reaching up to touch the wall. The moment my fingers made contact, a deep, splintering crack echoed through the house. The entire wall shuddered under my touch. And then the scratching started again. But this time, it was coming from inside the closet wall. Faster, desperate, clawing, digging. Something was behind it, and it was trying to get through. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The scratching grew frantic, like nails raking against wood. Then it stopped. Silence. Heavy. Expectant. I didn't move. Then, right against the wood, a slow, deliberate knock. 3 times. Boom. 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 I bolted. I ran down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet. The moment I reached the front door, I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking. As I yanked the door open, a sharp, cold gust of air rushed past me, pushing me forward, shoving me out. I staggered onto the porch, gasping. The door slammed shut behind me. I turned back, my chest heaving. The house was silent again, but something had changed. I could feel it. Whatever had been sealed away. I had woken it up. I didn't go back inside. Not that night. Maybe not ever. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, my heart still hammering in my chest. My breath came in short, ragged bursts. My hands trembled. The scratching, the knocking, the way the wall had shuddered beneath my touch. Something was inside that house. Something that wasn't supposed to be free. But I had set it loose. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the darkened windows, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Maybe I expected to see movement, a flicker of shadow passing behind the curtains, a light turning on by itself. But there was nothing, just silence, just waiting. Eventually, exhaustion crept in, dragging me down like a weight. I needed sleep. I needed time. I drove to a cheap motel on the edge of town, checked in without looking the receptionist in the eye, and collapsed onto the bed. The sheets smelled like stale cigarettes. The walls were thin. I could hear the muffled voices of people arguing in the next room, the hum of an old TV playing late-night infomercials. But it was safe. And for the first time in weeks, the house wasn't around me. I closed my eyes, willing sleep to come. But just as I began to drift, I heard it, faint, impossible, a single, slow knock, coming from the motel closet. I shot upright, my breath caught in my throat, my pulse slammed in my ears. The closet door was closed, but the air in the room was wrong, heavy, expectant, just like the house. I stared at the closet, waiting, my hands gripping the sheets so tightly my knuckles turned white. Nothing. Just silence. Just my imagination. Right? I forced myself to lie back down, keeping my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. I wouldn't sleep. I couldn't. But at some point, exhaustion won. And the nightmares came. Darkness stretched around me, endless and suffocating. The house loomed before me, its windows like empty, watching eyes. A whisper, a shadow shifting in the hall. The closet door slowly creaking open. A hand, asterisk, asterisk, too long. Too thin, asterisk, asterisk, reaching out. Then I woke with a gasp, my body slick with cold sweat. My heart hammered against my ribs. I wasn't in the house. I was in the motel. But the feeling hadn't left. The weight in the air. The sense of being watched. I turned my head slowly. The closet door was open. Not wide. Just an inch. Just enough to see darkness pressing beyond. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. Then a whisper from inside. Not words. Just breath. Too close. I bolted. I grabbed my keys, my wallet. Didn't even put my shoes on before I was out the door, running to my car. The motel clerk barely glanced at me as I tore out of the parking lot, hands shaking, breath shallow. I couldn't escape it. Wherever I went, asterisk, asterisk, it followed asterisk, asterisk. I only knew one thing. I had to go back. I had to finish this. Because whatever I had woken up, it wasn't going to let me go. I didn't want to go back. Every nerve in my body screamed against it. But what choice did I have? If I ran, it would follow. If I ignored it, it would find me. The house wasn't just a place anymore. It was a thing, a presence that had wound itself around me like a parasite. I had to end it. I drove back, just as the first traces of dawn crept over the horizon. The streets were empty, the world still asleep, but my mind was racing. The closer I got, the heavier the air became, like the house already knew I was coming. When I pulled into the driveway, I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping the wheel, staring at the front door. The porch light was still on, casting a dull yellow glow over the warped wood. The door looked the same as always. Ordinary, but I wasn't fooled. I took a deep breath and stepped out. The morning air was crisp, but I was sweating. My keys rattled in my hand as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The silence hit me first. Not normal silence. Asterisk, asterisk, a deep, hollow stillness, asterisk, asterisk, like the house was holding its breath, like it had been waiting. I closed the door behind me. Nothing moved, nothing creaked, but the air was wrong. I could feel it, thick and heavy against my skin, pressing down on me like an unseen hand. I forced myself to move. Every step felt like wading through something unseen, something that curled around my ankles, whispering against my skin. I made my way to the living room. The panel in the wall was wide open. I hadn't left it that way. My stomach twisted. The chair was still inside. But something else was too. The carving on the floor. It had changed. Before, it had just been a symbol. Deep, rough lines gouged into the wood. Now, the grooves were deeper, darker, as if something had been digging from underneath. I crouched down, my fingers hovering over the edges. The wood felt warm, like something was breathing beneath it. A whisper slid through the air, not from the wall, from behind me. I turned sharply. The hallway stretched in front of me, empty and dark. The bedroom doors were all closed. Nothing moved, but I wasn't alone. I could feel it, a presence, thick and cloying, pressing against my skin. The whisper came again, softer this time, curling around my ear like a breath. I swallowed hard. My throat was dry. I had to end this. I didn't know how, but I knew I had to seal it, whatever it was. I turned back to the symbol. Maybe I could destroy it. Maybe I could burn it, break it, cover it. A creak sounded from upstairs. Slow, deliberate. I stiffened. Then another creak. And another. Footsteps. Moving toward the staircase. My pulse pounded in my ears. My fingers clenched into fists. I had to see. I had to know. I rose to my feet and turned toward the stairs. Each step slow, careful. The air grew colder the higher I climbed. The hallway at the top was shrouded in shadow, the morning light barely reaching through the drawn curtains. I listened. Silence. Then, the closet door at the end of the hall creaked open. I froze. The darkness inside was thick, pressing outward like an exhale. Then, slowly, something stepped out. A shape, a shadow, too tall, too thin. It didn't move like a person. It glided, its limbs too long, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. And though I couldn't see its face, I knew it was looking at me. The whisper returned, curling through the air like smoke. Not words, just sound, a low, hungry murmur, like a voice speaking from somewhere deep beneath the earth. My body locked up. I couldn't run. I couldn't breathe. The shape lurched forward. I staggered back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My chest tightened, the air around me freezing, pressing in like a pair of unseen hands. Then, something shoved me, hard. I tumbled backward, slamming into the floor, my vision going white with pain. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scrambled to my feet, my head spinning. The shadow was gone, but the closet door was wide open now. And inside, the scratching had started again. From the walls, from the floor, from everywhere. Something underneath the house. Something waking up. I ran, down the stairs, through the hallway, past the open panel in the wall. The air pushed against me, almost shoving me back, but I didn't stop. I threw open the front door and stumbled outside, collapsing onto the porch, my chest heaving. The morning light was blinding, too bright after the darkness inside. But the second I stepped into it, the scratching stopped, the whisper vanished, the house went silent. I turned, staring at it. The windows were empty, the door still stood open, but I could feel it. The house was watching me, and whatever I had disturbed, it wasn't done with me yet.